What would you do if one moment of weakness destroyed the life you spent years building? This is the story of how I lost my family, my home, and myself, and why I still live every day trying to make sense of it all. Life doesn't always unfold the way we expect. When I was younger, I had this clear vision of a future filled with stability, love, and a sense of personal accomplishment. My parents instilled in me the importance of hard work and honesty, and those values became my guiding principles as I pursued my education and career. I wasn't exceptional, but I was determined to build a life that mattered. Meeting Jennifer was like finding a piece I didn't know was missing. She wasn't the loudest or flashiest person in the room, but there was a quiet strength about her that pulled me in. As time went on, our connection grew deeper, and I started to believe I had found the person I was meant to share my life with. Together, we dreamt of a future built on trust, shared ambitions, and mutual respect. For years, it felt like we were building that dream, working hard, facing challenges, and celebrating small victories as we climbed our way towards something greater. I thought we were in it together. But looking back, I realized the cracks in our marriage had started forming long before I noticed them. By the time I did, it was almost too late. That evening, I was deeply engrossed in reviewing files on my laptop when Jennifer entered the room. Her late nights had become routine, so on the surface, it didn't seem unusual. But there was something about this particular night that unsettled me. The kids had eaten dinner, finished their homework, and gone to bed over an hour ago without once asking where their mom was. It was a pattern I had overlooked for too long, but tonight, it gnawed at me in a way I couldn't ignore. I had spent the last hour sifting through our finances from the past 2 years, and the picture wasn't pretty. Our income had steadily declined, but Jennifer didn't seem concerned. She continued spending as if nothing had changed. I had paid the bills again that month, barely scraping by, but I knew this wasn't sustainable. If things kept going like this, we wouldn't last much longer. Doubts began creeping in, the kind that whisper in the back of your mind, asking if you made the wrong choices somewhere along the way. For 2 years, I'd been bracing myself for everything to fall apart, waiting for the inevitable collapse. It had felt like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode. But now, for the first time, I wasn't so sure if the bomb had already gone off, or if it was just about to. I noticed her standing in the doorway, quietly watching me. When our eyes finally met, she crossed her arms and said, "Michael, I want a divorce." I didn't know how to respond. My thoughts spiraled into chaos, uncertainty, self-loathing, and a strange sense of numbness all swirling together. It wasn't funny, but for a brief second, I felt like laughing. 17 years together, and now she was telling me it was over. Everything we had built was coming to an end. Oddly enough, that realization felt almost relieving. I stared at her, trying to summon memories of the good times, but the weight of the moment was too heavy. As much as I wanted to hold on to what we once had, I couldn't ignore the truth. I hadn't been happy for a long time. In many ways, I had lost myself along the way. I wasn't a great manager, though I had always been a talented programmer. When I got promoted to senior product development manager, it had felt like a win at first. But soon, it became clear that it was nothing more than a fancy title that kept me locked in endless meetings. I missed the hands-on work, the joy of writing code, and the thrill of problem-solving. Watching younger developers thrive while I sat on the sidelines only made me feel more disconnected. In hindsight, getting fired from Chicago Technology Solutions wasn't exactly a shock. I was barely showing up to meetings, missing deadlines, and putting in little effort to improve. I wasn't deliberately trying to lose my job, but I certainly wasn't fighting to keep it either. I had been struggling with depression for a long time, though I hadn't fully admitted it to myself. It took almost 3 months after being let go to begin making any real progress, and another month to find a path that felt remotely right. If it hadn't been for the kids and their daily routine, getting them to school, helping with homework, preparing meals, and tucking them into bed, I might have completely lost my mind. That routine gave me a sense of purpose when everything else felt meaningless. Slowly but surely, it helped me start to pull myself out of the darkness. I threw myself into being a stay-at-home dad, and to my surprise, the kids seemed to appreciate having me around more. Their smiles and simple moments of affection made me feel valued in a way I hadn't felt in years. But if my wife noticed the shift in me, she never said a word. I met Jennifer at a fraternity party back in college. I almost didn't go, but something about that night changed the course of my life. We clicked right away, and soon enough, we were inseparable. After college, I focused on climbing the career ladder, and by the time I landed a postgraduate manager role, things started to shift in a big way. The new salary was great, allowing us to upgrade our lifestyle. I felt more self-assured, and Jennifer, who was always beautiful to me, seemed even more radiant. Life, already good, started to feel even better. We began traveling more, spending quality time with the kids, and aggressively saving for retirement. When Emily started elementary school, Jennifer decided it was time to return to work. She found a part-time position at a marketing startup with flexible hours that fit perfectly around the kids' schedules. It seemed ideal. Life felt balanced, like we were doing everything right. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20ths. One evening, while cleaning the closet, I found something strange behind some boxes, a pink box tied with a white ribbon and a postcard that read, "Beloved." I hesitated, unsure of what to make of it, before deciding I'd wait to open it on my birthday. It felt like a thoughtful gesture, something she had planned for me. 2 days before my birthday, I wanted to show my appreciation, so I went all out, bought her flowers, gave her a foot rub, and made her favorite dinner. But Jennifer's response felt off. She seemed distant, like she was going through the motions without really being there. On my birthday, I made sure everything was in order. The kids finished their homework early, and I tried to create a peaceful atmosphere, hoping for a pleasant evening. But when Jennifer came home late, it threw me off completely. She offered a quick apology, but something in her tone, something in her manner, felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Later that night, I checked the closet, only to find the pink box was gone. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. My mind raced with all kinds of scenarios, none of them good. For the next few days, I tried to brush off the nagging doubt. I wanted to believe it was nothing, just a misunderstanding. After all, the idea of Jennifer cheating had never crossed my mind, not once in all our years together. But when she called me 13 days later, saying she'd be late because of Alan's 30th birthday celebration at the office, something in her tone made me pause. There was a shift, a coldness, a feeling I couldn't quite place. Later that evening, as I walked toward the closet, I glanced at the empty space where the gift had once been. That empty spot felt like a slap in the face. My stomach twisted, and for a moment, I felt like I might be sick. The weight of realization pressed down on me, and though the evidence was barely noticeable, it was enough. That moment shattered whatever remained of my love for her. I wish I could say I confronted her then and there, but I didn't. I was crushed, numb, like a zombie, for weeks. I went through the motions of daily life while she carried on as if everything was fine, as if nothing had changed. It wasn't until our 15th wedding anniversary that I tried to snap out of it, or at least pretend to. Jennifer told me she'd be attending a work conference that day, completely ignoring the significance of the date. That hurt more than anything else. It was as if the years we had spent together meant nothing to her. That night, something inside me broke. In the middle of my despair, an idea struck me: if we had nothing, Jennifer couldn't take anything. It wasn't a solution, but it felt like the only way to regain control over a situation that had spiraled out of my grasp. I made the decision to drain our savings and stop looking for another job. It was reckless, I knew that, but it gave me a sense of control in a life that had become unrecognizable. For 2 years, I lived in that state of uncertainty. Every day felt like a drawn-out battle, and eventually, I realized something that shook me: I was alone. Jennifer had always been the heart of our social life. Without her, I had no real friendships to fall back on. I was an only child, and both of my parents had already passed away. For those 2 years, my kids were the only bright spot in my life. To distract myself from the growing emptiness, I focused on the kids. I made a daily log of their activities, school events, sports practices, little moments that brought me joy. I won't say how much keeping busy in this way cost me, but it was more than I'm comfortable admitting. You might wonder if Jennifer noticed all the spending. The truth is, I think she did, at least some of it. I had to tell her about the money I transferred to the kids' accounts because I needed her signature to set things up. She saw the new car too but didn't say a word. Maybe she assumed I was still working and that everything was under control. She spent money as well, and I didn't comment on it either. It was as though we were living parallel lives, disconnected but pretending everything was fine. During that time, I found myself wondering about the man she was seeing. I had my suspicions, but I wanted more than just intuition, I needed proof. I don't want to go into the details of how I got the reports, but let's just say they confirmed what I already knew. Strangely, I felt more relieved than hurt when I finally had the truth in front of me. It didn't change much emotionally, but at least now I wasn't second-guessing myself anymore. The reports weren't as shocking as I had feared. Alan Henderson, her boss, wasn't much of a lover. It seemed he liked to spread his attention around to several women in the office. That part caught me off guard. I had assumed that whatever he and Jennifer had was more serious, but it turned out they were just two people casually enjoying each other's company. The other men mentioned in the reports followed a similar pattern. But there was one client who stood out, a geeky guy with glasses and a bit of an awkward vibe. It didn't seem like he would have been her type, but clearly, I didn't know her as well as I once thought. Alongside everything else, I started dedicating a significant amount of my time to studying divorce. I wasn't just looking at it from a legal perspective, I wanted to understand every angle of what I was about to go through. I knew I needed to prepare myself, not just financially but emotionally too. I wasn't ready to make any moves yet, but I wanted to be armed with the knowledge when the time came. It was the only thing that gave me a sense of control in a situation where I felt powerless. I spent a lot of time trying to understand how divorce affects children, because, for me, that was the hardest part. I had already endured most of the emotional pain myself, but I wanted to be ready for the challenges my kids would face. Some of the advice I found online seemed generic and impractical, but I kept searching. I wasn't going to leave anything to chance when it came to protecting them. About 8 months into this phase, a new kind of anxiety began to set in. Panic crept in quietly, catching me off guard. Jennifer's reaction to everything had been so cold, so indifferent. She barely seemed affected by any of it. One night, when the kids and I had an impromptu movie night and came home late, I noticed a gift sitting on the dining table, unopened. Jennifer wasn't around, and by the time we woke up the next morning, she was already gone. Just like that, life returned to its usual rhythm. She started spending more time at the office, and when she was home, we barely exchanged more than a few words. A few days later, she finally told me she wanted a divorce. I wasn't surprised, honestly, I had been expecting it. I just hoped she'd make it quick. But it took nearly a week before she handed over the papers. When I finally got a chance to read them, I wasn't shocked by anything they contained, but I knew I couldn't take anything for granted. I didn't want to fight dirty, but I also wasn't about to leave myself vulnerable. I made sure everything I had, the reports, the financials, everything, was included in my countersuit. I wanted her to understand that I wasn't afraid to use whatever leverage I had if it meant protecting myself and the kids. That night, after the kids grabbed a snack and went upstairs to get ready for bed, Jennifer sat at the dining table, looking distant. The kids didn't acknowledge her, and she made no effort to talk to them. It was as if they were strangers sharing the same house. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat down across from her. She didn't look up right away, and I didn't rush her. I took my time with the beer, letting the silence stretch between us. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and flat. "What am I supposed to do now?" I set the beer down slowly, meeting her gaze for the first time that evening. "Is that a rhetorical question?" I asked, "or do you actually want my advice?" She didn't answer immediately, and for a moment, I wondered if she even knew herself. I didn't give her a chance to answer. Instead, I leaned forward and said, "Well, here's what I think. You could run away, start over somewhere new. That's probably what I'd do if I were in your shoes. Don't worry about the kids, I'll never let you be a real part of their lives, so that shouldn't factor into your decision." Jennifer's expression hardened, but I didn't stop. "Or," I continued, "you could stay here, keep your head down, and hope for the best. But who knows? People might find out about your little escapades. Good luck finding someone who'll hire you once that happens. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find some loser who doesn't care that you've been sleeping around." She didn't say anything, just sat there, cold and distant as ever. The silence dragged on, and eventually, I walked away, leaving her to sit alone with her thoughts. The divorce was messy, and the fallout was worse. It took time, but word of the scandal spread. Jennifer's reputation and Alan Henderson's, her boss, were ruined. Their firm lost clients one by one until the business dried up, and they were forced to file for bankruptcy. Alan was ousted from his position and fled the city in disgrace. The money I received from the settlement wasn't much, but watching their downfall felt like a victory in itself. Of course, I wasn't immune to the consequences. People who knew about my situation sometimes taunted me or made snide remarks. It stung at first, but eventually, I learned to tune it out. I didn't care anymore, I had already accepted that this was my life now. Through it all, my kids grew up. I never resented them for what happened. In fact, they were the only thing that kept me grounded. I was determined not to let my bitterness seep into their lives. Mrs. Jensen, our longtime housekeeper, stayed on with us until the kids went off to college. After that, she retired, but I offered her room and board as a thank you for her years of service. She tried, in her own quiet way, to convince me to move on with my life, to open myself up to the possibility of something new. But I never did. When Mrs. Jensen passed away, I was left with a profound sense of loneliness. The house felt emptier than ever. I never sought help, I just let the years drift by, one after the other. My life became hollow, distant. Sure, money allowed me to keep up appearances, but it didn't fill the void. I lived a quiet, isolated existence, keeping people at arm's length. I still remember the day I sent Jennifer a gift, a simple package with a note inside. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was my way of closing a chapter that never really felt closed. Or maybe, after all the bitterness and hurt, I just wanted her to know that I had moved past it, even if only on the surface. I bought lingerie from Jennifer's favorite store, wrapped it carefully with a white ribbon, and included a note. It was brief, sharp, and laced with the kind of bitterness I hoped she would recognize. I didn't expect any response, sending the gift was more for my own closure than anything else. Not long after that, one of her new suitors showed up at my door, visibly drunk. Without warning, he shoved me back, knocking me to the ground. That was his first mistake. I wasn't a fighter by nature, but my anger boiled over. I defended myself, and before I knew it, the situation escalated into a full-blown physical altercation. By the time it ended, we were both bruised, bloodied, and breathing heavily. I stared him down as he staggered away, muttering curses under his breath. Later that week, I ran into Jennifer at a public event. Her eyes met mine across the room, and for a brief moment, I could see sadness in her gaze, perhaps regret, perhaps something else entirely. I didn't care to figure it out. As I approached, she glanced at my hand and then back into my eyes. With a steady voice, I said, "By the way, you ruined my life." She opened her mouth, as if to respond, but I didn't wait. I'm glad you found someone. I hope he makes you happy. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked away. My driver was already waiting at the curb. Good evening, Mr. Smith. Did the evening go well? He asked as I climbed into the car. Settling into the seat, I sighed and replied, it went as well as I could have hoped. Let's go home, Jonathan. As you wish, sir, he nodded, pulling the car into the quiet night. That night, I lay awake, haunted by dreams of a past I could never quite escape. I woke up knowing she was just a memory now, one that I would eventually let fade. The life I built afterward wasn't what I had envisioned all those years ago, but in its imperfect way, it was real. And somehow, it was enough. I grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, surrounded by the familiar buzz of well-meaning neighbors and childhood friends. From an early age, it felt like my life was on a steady conveyor belt, moving toward a future laid out by tradition and expectations. My parents, loving and supportive, wanted only the best for me. But their vision for my future wasn't always aligned with my own. They dreamed of stability, a predictable life that followed a well-worn path. I followed that path for years, trying to live up to their expectations, even as a quiet sense of restlessness grew inside me. That restlessness is what led me, years later, to moments like this one, standing outside a crowded venue, leaning against a lamp post, silently wishing the night would end. Inside, the noise and chaos continued, and I had spent the better part of the evening dodging leering stares and drunken attempts at conversation. And then, he appeared, Michael. He wasn't striking or particularly memorable at first glance, but there was something about him, a quiet confidence that set him apart. He approached me with an easy smile, introducing himself in a way that immediately put me at ease. We exchanged pleasantries, and for the first time that night, I felt calm. We talked for a while, and though the conversation was light, it left an impression. A week passed before I worked up the nerve to call him. When we finally met for coffee, I quickly realized what made Michael stand out. He wasn't flashy or overly charismatic, but he was incredibly intelligent. He had this ability to talk about anything with ease, and his genuine interest in me was clear. We spoke about my struggles with ancient philosophy, something I had been grappling with in school, and, to my surprise, he offered to help me study. 3 days later, we met again. It wasn't so much studying as it was a masterclass in philosophy. Michael had a way of breaking down complex ideas and explaining them patiently. I found myself drawn to him, not just because of his knowledge, but because of how he made me feel. He didn't judge, didn't push. He simply listened and offered clarity when I needed it most. Those moments stayed with me, even as life moved forward and things inevitably changed. They were brief, but they mattered. In a world that felt chaotic and unpredictable, Michael had been a rare constant, even if only for a little while. I struggled with feelings of inadequacy, though Michael never once made me feel that way. He always seemed to understand me in a way that few ever had. I remember the first time he completely stunned me. Oddly enough, it happened at a sorority event. He showed up, dressed in maroon and sky blue, with his friends all wearing matching outfits and carrying a cooler of food. I was puzzled at first, unsure of what he was up to. Then, he took me on a tour of the sorority house, and as we rounded the corner, I was speechless. The entire room had been transformed, West Ham colors decorated every inch, and his friends started chanting familiar cheers. Michael had organized the surprise because he knew I had missed a trip to England to see my cousin play for West Ham. He went so far as to record the game, learn the chants, and make me feel like I hadn't missed a thing. It was thoughtful, over the top in the best way, and completely unforgettable. Being with Michael lifted my self-esteem in ways I didn't expect. He openly praised me, and I knew it wasn't just out of politeness. He genuinely admired me, and that admiration made me feel seen. He wasn't just attractive or fit, he had this understated charm that made people gravitate toward him. Around strangers, he was quiet and reserved, but with me, he was completely open. He never sought the spotlight, preferring to focus on us and our life together. Michael always claimed he was just a regular guy who had gotten lucky meeting me, but I knew better. He was extraordinary. There were countless moments that proved it, but one that stands out was when he asked my father for permission to marry me. He didn't tell me right away. It wasn't until 2 hours later, after casually slipping it into conversation, that I realized he had planned the whole thing. That night, after a romantic dinner, he proposed at Willis Tower, under a sky full of stars. The city lights reflected the joy in my heart, and in that moment, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. It was everything I had dreamed of. For a long time, Michael was my anchor. He made me feel grounded in a world where I had often felt out of place. As a college student, I had been one of the few maids working in a sorority house, and it had made me self-conscious. But with Michael, none of that mattered. He didn't just love me, he made me feel like I belonged. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being honest with him. That was my greatest mistake. If I had told him about the small insecurities that started to grow inside me, he would have helped. I know he would have. Michael was that kind of man, always willing to lift me up when I felt low. But instead, I kept those feelings to myself, and they festered. Over time, especially after the kids started school, I began to feel restless, like something was missing. It wasn't his fault, it was mine. I convinced myself that I needed something more, something outside the life we had built. I wasn't searching for another man, but the routine of our life began to feel flat. That restlessness made me vulnerable, and it crept into every part of my life, including work. My boss, Alan Henderson, wasn't someone I would have normally been interested in. He was handsome, sure, but he was notorious for his string of short-lived relationships and flings. Everyone teased him about it. I wasn't the type to fall for the first man who paid me attention, and initially, I dismissed him firmly. But as time passed, something shifted. He was charming and smooth in a way that made me feel desirable again, in a way I hadn't felt in years. I can't pinpoint the exact moment it changed, but I allowed myself to get swept up in the attention, in the thrill of being noticed. Alan knew how to push my buttons, and before I fully understood what was happening, I found myself tangled in an affair. Looking back, I see the depth of my betrayal, and it's something I will always regret. The truth is, I didn't feel undesired by Michael, I let my own insecurities convince me otherwise. I became trapped by those insecurities, chained by my own restlessness, and the reality of what I had done hit me like a ton of bricks. For the next 18 months, I lived in that reality, unable to break free from the guilt and shame. I had lost something irreplaceable, not because of what Michael lacked, but because of what I failed to confront within myself. I had become nothing more than a pawn in Alan's twisted game. He wasn't just my boss anymore, he was my pimp, using me for his own gain, and I hated him for it. But more than that, I hated myself for letting it get to this point. Every attempt I made to escape failed miserably. He always seemed one step ahead, tightening his grip on me with each passing day. It wasn't until I reached my breaking point, when I was asked to entertain a man in a conference room full of people, that I finally found the courage to say no. I walked straight into Alan's office, trembling but determined, and told him I was done. I didn't care what happened after that, I just knew I couldn't keep living like this. For the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of strength, like I had finally reclaimed a piece of myself. But walking away from Alan didn't fix everything. When I tried to go back to Michael and suggest we go to marriage counseling, hoping we could still salvage what was left of our marriage, he didn't respond the way I had hoped. He didn't shout or accuse me, he just stopped speaking altogether. It wasn't that he stopped trusting me, he simply stopped engaging with me entirely. For weeks, there was nothing but silence. I was constantly on edge, waiting for something, anything, to change. Then my birthday came, and I thought, maybe, just maybe, he won't ignore me today. I clung to that hope, telling myself that he would surely acknowledge me on my special day. But I couldn't have been more wrong. When I walked through the door after work, eager to see what surprises my family might have planned, the house was eerily quiet. There were no decorations, no cake, no cheerful greetings. Just silence. That moment broke something in me. If there had been any hope left of salvaging our marriage, it faded that night. I didn't fight for us, I didn't try to work through the issues anymore. I was done. It didn't take long before I found an attorney and started the divorce process. When I met with her, I laid everything out, telling her how Michael had emotionally shut down, how he refused to speak or even consider counseling. I felt justified in my decision, and my lawyer latched onto every word I said, assuring me that I would come out on top. Together, we went over the divorce settlement, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I was finally doing something for myself, something that gave me control again. But divorce isn't clean. It isn't as simple as signing papers and moving on. The process was long, and the tension only grew worse over time. I remember one particular day vividly. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing some documents, while the company's lawyer and mine argued back and forth in the conference room. Their voices were loud, almost theatrical, with papers flying and tempers flaring. The chaos in the room was so distracting that I didn't notice someone standing by my desk until he spoke. "Jennifer Smith," the man said, his voice calm but firm. Startled, I looked up, unsure of who he was or what he wanted. But something about the way he said my name sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't over, far from it. I turned toward the man, confused. "Yes. You've been served," he said bluntly, handing me a thick envelope. He snapped a quick photo of me holding the papers, then walked away before I could even process what had just happened. As I stood there, stunned, the HR manager and a security guard approached. "Mrs. Smith," the HR manager said, his tone cold and detached. "We need to speak with you." It didn't take long to figure out what was happening. News of my affair with Alan had spread fast, and the company wasn't about to risk its reputation by keeping me around. I didn't argue or plead, I already knew there was no point. Within minutes, I was escorted out of the building, my belongings hastily shoved into a cardboard box. Later that day, I tried calling my father. I wanted to explain, to say something, anything, but before I could get a word in, he spat out a single sentence laced with disgust: "You're nothing but a hoe." Then he hung up. No further explanation was needed. I already knew what I had done, and I had no defense. The following week felt like a complete descent into isolation. I barely left the house, unable to face the world outside. But in hindsight, I would later think of those days as the calm before the storm. Michael had left a brief note on the kitchen counter, saying he was taking the kids camping for the weekend and would be back Sunday. The note was devoid of warmth or familiarity, just a simple statement of fact. That first night alone, I got a call from my friend Rebecca. "Jennifer, listen to me," she said, her voice tense. "Michael sent me a DVD. I don't know what's on it, but I'm warning you, you don't want to know." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. As the days dragged on, anxiety gnawed at me. I couldn't stop thinking about that DVD and what it might contain. I was trapped in a limbo of dread, waiting for the inevitable fallout. When Michael finally returned with the kids, he didn't say a word to me. He barely even looked in my direction. I tried to talk to him, to apologize, to suggest counseling once more, but he shut me down with silence. His indifference was suffocating, each moment of cold distance chipping away at whatever hope I had left. I kept trying, though, trying to fix what I had broken. But Michael had withdrawn so completely, it was as if I had ceased to exist in his eyes. Then came my birthday. I had clung to the fragile hope that maybe he'd acknowledge it, that maybe things weren't entirely beyond repair. But when I walked through the door after work, the house was eerily quiet. No decorations, no cake, no family waiting to surprise me. Nothing. The crushing weight of that emptiness was almost too much to bear. A few days later, a package arrived. It was a standard gift box from a store I recognized, but it wasn't the contents that left me breathless, it was the card. The tone was unmistakable, leaving no doubt that Michael knew everything. The weight of that realization hit me like a freight train. He knew. He had known all along. I was staying at a friend's place by then, a guy named Robert. He was decent enough, though I could tell he hoped for something more than just friendship. When he saw the package, he exploded. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, before storming out of the apartment. I tried to stop him, but he was gone before I could say a word. Hours passed, and when he didn't return, I began to worry. I had made a mess of everything, my marriage, my friendships, my entire life. When Robert finally came back, he didn't say much. He was disappointed, hurt, and angry. "You should just leave," he said quietly. "Michael will never forgive you. He'll never forget. You're only making it worse for yourself." So I ran. I left behind everything, my life, my family, the dream I had once built, and moved to a small town in Virginia, far from everything familiar. I found a terrible job that barely paid the bills, but it was enough to survive. A few years later, I met a man who tolerated my presence. We didn't love each other, there was no passion, no connection. We simply coexisted. And strangely, that felt like punishment, penance for what I had done. Life in my small Virginia town isn't what I envisioned for myself, but I've learned to live with the choices that brought me here. Each day feels like quiet atonement for the love I squandered and the trust one shattered. The man I now call my husband, if I can even use that term, is kind enough to share this lifeless partnership with me. But I know he sees our relationship as a matter of convenience rather than any genuine bond. Occasionally, I catch glimpses of Michael's life through updates from our children. He's moved on in ways I never could, and while I'm glad they still have him, each update feels like a reminder of the life I threw away. This existence I've carved out for myself isn't one of happiness or fulfillment. It's survival, nothing more, nothing less. And perhaps that's what I deserve.